And new information, of course, we ask the questions using the five W's: who, what, when, where, why, and of course, the one H, how. News traditionally should answer these questions, but of course, today we now know that it doesn't always do that, right? So it can have different relevance for different people, depending on where in the world you're from, how you consume news, what exactly you think is important and what is not. That kind of defines what is news for the individual. There are many sources that people use to get news. There's mainstream media, of course, which is kind of like a general umbrella term where we talk about television, where we talk about radio, where we talk about the newspapers. Um, Nowadays, a lot of people get news from social media. You can also get news from word of mouth, hearing from the people around you, from coworkers, from family and friends, as well as people can get news from email newsletters, particularly from independent media. There is some research that has been done regarding how people consume news. And from this Pew research, we can see that there is a large percentage of US adults that get their news from digital devices, using television, using radio, and also people still read the printed newspapers. But more and more people are getting information from digital devices. Even those who still read the newspapers or listen to the radio will still get news from their digital devices. And from the Pew Research, we can see that it levels around somewhere between 55 and 60% of Americans that get their news from digital devices. People who get their news from digital platforms have different ways or different sources that they go to for news. So a lot of people still go to news websites or apps that they get their news from. For example, New York Times, which is considered a main source of news in the US. They have an app also, they have their website, and many people get their news from these news websites. But more and more people are also getting news from what would be considered non-traditional sources. For example, people get news from social media, people get news from podcasts, and people get news from search engines, and of course, email newsletters. And in the last couple of years, the share of people who are getting news from podcasts are growing, as this chart from Pew Research shows. And of course, they've started to measure people getting news from email newsletters and AI chatbots, which is, of course, increasing with the use of AI. According to this Pew Research, the news consumption varies across platforms, and a lot of this depends on age, gender, race, ethnicity, and educational attainment. Americans who are older are more likely to get news from television and print publications, and they are less likely to use digital sources such as social media or podcasts. Americans with a college degree are more likely to get news from news websites or apps or podcasts or email newsletters. But those without a college degree are more likely to get news from social media. So there is kind of like a divergence there where we can see that a lot of this is defined not just by age, but by educational attainment. Now, let's look at misinformation versus disinformation. This has become increasingly relevant because more and more people, as we saw on the previous slide, are getting news from social media, podcasts, and even from AI chatbots. And so misinformation and disinformation are on the rise. What is misinformation? That is false or inaccurate information where the facts are just wrong. This information has an element of deliberate of intention to it. So it's false information, but it is the purpose is to deliberately mislead people, whereas misinformation may not be deliberate, but the information is just wrong. A person may genuinely believe the information that they are sharing or spreading. But disinformation is when the information is known to be false, but they are sharing this information and stating it as if it is true. So the American Psychology Association has done some interesting research as to how and why misinformation spreads. Firstly, exposure to misinformation increases the odds that people will believe it. For example, when we see something that's popular and it's being shared and it's being amplified over and over again, it increasing the odds that people believe that this is true, or else why else would this information just be out there? And then the other thing is that people don't necessarily need to believe misinformation in order to share it. People may just be sharing it because they think that, maybe other people might be interested in this, or maybe this is something that people are talking about. But people share information all the time on social media that they themselves don't necessarily believe. Another thing is that people may share information that they know is false, but it signals their political affiliation, it disparages their perceived opponents, or accrue social rewards. For example, in the previous election cycle, in the 2024 election cycle in the US, where there was information that was being spread about Haitians eating cats and dogs. And people knew, admittedly, that this information was false, but they shared it anyway because it was perceived as helpful to the political agenda at that time. And so this information was shared, even though many of the people sharing it knew that the information was false. And people are more likely to share when it aligns with their personal identity or social norms, when it is novel, or if it elicits strong emotions. So, for example, people may share information about minority groups because they know that it will get engagement, right? It may earn them followers, or it may just enrage people and incite people to spread the information and to engage with the content. And so people are more likely to share information when they know that it will elicit these kinds of emotions. So, how does social media play into all this? Now, the algorithms are designed to track user engagement. And so the algorithms on these social media apps will tie into, for example, some kind of content or videos that they know that you've interacted with in the past, and they know this is a topic that is of interest to you. They're more likely to prioritize that information and show you more of that content. The algorithm, unfortunately, tends to favor content that spurs negative emotions like anger and outrage. So once you there is content out there that people are getting upset about and people are talking about, and it makes the news and it gets everyone all riled up. Unfortunately, the algorithm does tend to amplify that kind of information. And so more and more people will seek to spread it. Most online information originates from a small minority of what's known as super spreaders, meaning there are probably people who have a lot of followers. There are people who are always engaged, always online, and from their audience, they are able to just put one little tidbit out there. And then because they have a lot of followers, this information gets amplified more and more. Social media also tends to amplify their reach. Again, because information is because the algorithm tends to favor content that spurs negative emotions. Social media, when these small group of super spreaders put this little bit of information out there, the social media platforms will expand their reach and push it forward. And it does not have to be someone who has a lot of followers. The content itself may just be something that has riled people up in the past, that has sparked anger and outrage in the past, and the algorithm recognizes this pattern and decides to amplify that content once more. So, what is the role of AI in all of this? Now, of course, we can't go a day now without hearing about AI and how, it is the next big thing that's going to take over. So, AI unfortunately has led to a really rapid increase in the output of synthetic media. And that's just a generic term for any content that includes that includes audio, images, or video that's created by artificial intelligence. And this leads us now to deepfakes. A deepfake is a computer generated video, image, or audio clip that uses artificial intelligence to make someone appear to say or do something that they never actually did. And we've seen several examples of that, even with Mark Zuckerberg, right, who owns Meta, formerly known as Facebook, and also with some very famous people, Elon Musk. There have been deep fake actors like Tom Cruise, for example. There have been deep fakes. There have been deep fakes of famous politicians. So this is an increasing problem. Now, deep fakes differ fundamentally from traditional disinformation in that they are very convincing, they are scalable, and they're increasingly accessible. So, meaning anyone can make them, and people can make, as generative AI gets more and more into everyone's hands, into the hands of, the common man out there, everyone has access to it. More and more people are able to make these deep fake videos or audios, and bad actors can use these to influence people in some really harmful ways. Social media amplifies these threats through the illusory truth effect, where repeated exposure makes the information seem more credible regardless of the accuracy. So then you keep seeing this video over and over and over again, and suddenly you don't know what's real and what's not real because it keeps repeating, it keeps playing. Every time you open the app, this is the same videos that come up. And so you start to believe that it is in fact true when it's not. What are some examples of deep fakes? You have videos of celebrities or politicians making controversial statements or endorsements. We have audios or videos with politically charged messages designed to manipulate electoral outcomes. And we're seeing this being used increasingly, not just in the United States, but in different parts of the world. We're seeing this being used increasingly over and over again to manipulate elections. We see also audio of family members or close friends. Scammers are using this to commit fraud. Someone may get a telephone call. There's a famous case of a grandmother who got a telephone call from her grandson pleading and begging that, they needed money. They were in a dire situation. And it sounded very much like her grandson when it was not. Scammers were using his voice to commit fraud or to attempt to commit fraud. AI and deepfakes are being used in revenge porn, and unfortunately, people are using generative AI to undress random people. So you may have just an innocent photograph on the internet. AI uses it to scan the photo and undress you. They are also using it, unfortunately, to create explicit images of minors. So there are a lot of bad actors out there who are using these deepfake videos to commit real harm to people who use the internet. So, what can you do? Well, you're not entirely helpless. There are a few things you can do. It is difficult for us personally to just to stop it as an individual, but there are some steps that you can do to minimize your exposure to these bad actors who use deepfakes and other forms of AI. So here are some things that you can do. 4 ways that's recommended by the American Psychology Association: debunking, pre-bunking, literacy training, and nudging. And let's go through these one by one. So the first one is debunking, commonly known as fact checking, which is the correct of misinformation. This is more commonly used after someone has been exposed to misinformation, and it's most successful when it includes a detailed explanation that refutes incorrect information and replaces it with facts. So you don't have to let misinformation slide. You can go fact checking to make sure that you have information to debunk it in the immediacy as you hear this misinformation. Fact checking is very time consuming, and that is a hurdle that we face these days when everyone wants instant gratification. You really have to spend the time, even as the internet becomes more crowded, so to speak. You really do have to spend time to find the facts to do this debunking. So it can be time consuming, and it may not fully reverse the effects of misinformation, and it may require repeated correction. You do have to kind of reinforce as people are exposed more and more to this misinformation. It does take a reinforcing of the fact checking of the facts to kind of debunk that misinformation. So it can lose its effectiveness over time. Another method is pre-bunking, which is kind of like a preemptive debunking, where you try to prevent people from encountering misinformation in the first place. And one of the ways to do this is what's known as psychological inoculation, which is kind of like a pre-exposure to a falsehood to kind of build up some resistance before someone encounters misinformation. For example, you can warn people and say people may try to manipulate you, by saying that everyone does this thing. But categorically, this is not true because this research showed that only a small percentage of people actually do this. Pre-bunking interventions can reduce susceptibility to specific falsehoods and to larger techniques that are used to manipulate information. However, even though they may be more effective than debunking, you need brief reminders or boosters to extend their effectiveness over time. It's also uncertain if pre-bunking works under all conditions and across cultures, but there is some potential for you to use this tool to forestall misinformation at scale. Another method is literacy training, and congrats, you are doing it today. You can use digital literacy to help people improve the way they judge the quality and accuracy of information that they encounter online or how they perform online tasks. More research is needed to determine which of the literacy interventions are most effective against misinformation, but it can be very effective when paired with other counter misinformation tools such as debunking. There's also nudging, which are small environmental changes that can be used to alter behavior in predictable and positive ways. Accuracy nudges ask people to consider the veracity of information before sharing it. So when you encounter something on the internet, do you pause for a bit and check, is this real? Do you do a quick search? Do you look at your trusted website or your trusted source to see who is reporting this? You can do this before sharing information. So you can remind people how to alter their own behavior to counter misinformation. There's also social norm nudges that highlight community standards of behavior about reporting information. So, for example, you can say to people, okay, when you encounter this information or this missing piece of misinformation, do you know how to report it? Do you know all these social media platforms have tools to report what information that may be harmful, for example? Use those tools. So encourage people to use those tools when they encounter this on social media platforms, for example. And then there are motivational nudges that reward people for being as accurate as possible. The thing about nudges is that they may not work for very long, and we don't know how well they work for some audiences. And the efficacy, though, can be enhanced by combining them with other approaches. So, for example, if you are encouraging people to debunk information, if you are encouraging people to get educated on how to spot deep fakes and how to counteract deep fakes, then you can use also nudging as a reinforcement in that regard. Well, look at that. Smart people can be victims too. You know, we can have information, we can do our media literacy, we can arm ourselves in many ways, but having information and education doesn't make us immune to what's happening out there with everyone. These deepfakes are really good, and the AI tools are getting better and better every time. And so, even as smart as we are, we can also fall victims to these deep fakes as well. So if you say, I don't use AI, some of these things can happen to me. Well, the truth is that it can happen to anyone. These technologies can scrub our data from the internet, and nowadays almost everyone has something on a social media platform. So they can grab our videos, they can grab our photographs, they can grab our voice recordings, and they can make samples with all this information that we already have on the internet. So think hard about what you share publicly, right? Your location, some of the videos of like the interior of your house, for example. Some of these information that we share, we want to think before, is this something that I really want the internet to know? And you can limit the amount of data that's available out there, especially high quality photos that can be used to create a deep fake. You don't have to share all those information, or you can upload it with a timer so that it's only available for a limited time, as well as you can adjust the settings on social media platforms so that only the people that you trust or that's in your immediate circle can see this information. What else can you do? Stay up to date on deepfakes and AI. Stay abreast of the latest developments. Stay vigilant. And this can help you to recognize red flags when you encounter suspicious content. Also, use the tools again to report deepfake content. If you come across content that involves you or someone you know, or even someone you don't know, and you suspect that it's this deepfake content, report it to this platform that's hosting the content, and any other agency or body that's out there that regulates this kind of thing. You can report it. This can help in having it removed, or at very least limit its potential reach. What's the path forward? There's a global and there's a personal approach, right? One of the things that we can do is to verify before sharing. We can take our own personal steps. Even if we may not be able to spot what a deep fake is, it may be very convincing that we can't spot that it's a deep fake, but we can take steps to verify. We can pause and we can look and look into additional sources to verify this information before we share it. But we can't take the approach as we did with recycling of plastics and other recyclable material. This image is here because the approach we took to recycling was to dump it on the individual and say, you need to use paper straws. You need to make sure that you are recycling your water bottles and you are saving the turtles and doing all this, when in fact the responsibility should be on the major companies and corporations that makes this plastic in abundance and distributes it to the population. The onus really should be on them. And so we can't use this same approach with AI to say to the individual, it's up to you to spot a deep fake, right? It's up to you to ensure that you don't fall a victim. We can do our small part, but ultimately, it's the governments around the world that have to take the reins on this. So, one of the things that governments across the world can do is to rethink education approaches. Now that we have this beast, so to speak, that has been unleashed on the world. It's up to governments to rethink, how do we teach young people how to spot deepfakes? How do we teach young people to use AI responsibly? How do we teach young people that they can um, develop the skills needed to debunk information and think critically about information and debunk it, and even to pre-bunk it if they have the skills to do so. So this involves developing regulatory frameworks that works across cultures. And one approach that has was is to label AI generated content. It's very simple that if an audio or video is AI generated, it should be labeled as such. So the viewer, the user, the reader should not have to guess if this content is AI generated or not. The companies that are responsible for making software and putting this software out there that can generate deepfake videos, deepfake audios should be the ones that have the onus, and should governments should put regulatory infrastructure in place so that all this content is labeled as AI generated so that everyone knows what they're seeing as these deepfakes come into the public domain. So finally, what can we do? Again, we can use AI responsibly. We can change our personal approach with media and especially social media. We can take control of our algorithms. We can choose whether or not we want to interact with certain content, and we can choose whether or not we want to share certain content. In our small circle, we can share media literacy skills. We can teach those around us how to use media in a responsible way, and also teach them how to use the tools that you've learned to debunk and pre-bunk misinformation. And finally, we can also support legislative changes for responsible use of AI, such as the labeling of AI generated content to help everyone know whether you have the skills or not. That everyone knows that content is generated by AI, and so they know how to interact with it, and we all don't have to guess.